Happy Sunday, everybody. So, as we kind of come to the end of Aether Drift here, what I've done is I've spent a fair amount of time putting together a list of 17 budget decks and upgrades. So, in a total of 34 decks that I'll be presenting today. And what I've tried to do is I've tried to make the decks, all of the budget decks are just commons and uncommons, and I've tried to make them as competitive as possible. Now, some of them are going to be more competitive than others, and some of them are going to be easier to pilot than others. But they're all hopefully viable decks that are enjoyable to play. And then I'm also going to showcase the upgraded version, which includes rares and mythics. Now, the reason why I did this was I've always done kind of presenting my best budget decks. And, it'll be like mono red without the complete mice package. And you can, of course, do that. I think that, if you're really going to go for the spike, I'm going to just try to get up to top 1200 mythic. Crafting mono red is a really great way to go. It's relatively cheap, right? But this is a way to kind of explore or get some color challenges done for beginners, that sort of thing. It's not that much of a, you don't have to invest that much if it's just made out of commons and uncommons. And then if you like the deck, I can kind of try to take it into a more competitive version. But for example, like Dimir Poison isn't really a tier 1 or a tier 2 deck as far as the meta is concerned, right? So just keep that in mind, craft with care, and I'll kind of walk you through what I came up with, right? So first up here is the Dimir Poison budget build. And we've had this one actually for a little bit of time, largely after Phyrexia All Will Be One, where you're trying to win through giving your opponent poison counters. So if they get to 10 poison counters, you just win the game. So there's a couple of cards like Vraska's Fall, the Prologue to Phyresis, that just give your opponent a poison counter. And then cards like Experimental Augury, Whisper of the Dross, Drown in Ichor, all of the proliferate cards then increase the number of poison counters that your opponent has. And then we've got a couple payoffs for your opponent having corrupted, which is like Anoint with Affliction, Bring the Ending, Distorted Curiosity. These cards just getting better if your opponent has 3 or more poison counters. And then we have a creatureless build, which is to kind of take advantage. I guess there is a near creatureless build to make the cards that are removal basically bricks in our opponent's hand. And so there's some strategies that this sort of thing actually works really well against. There's some strategies where this deck is going to struggle against, right? So, but you do have a fair amount of tools against other aggro strategies, being able to attack your opponent's creatures relatively well, and then ramping into winning the game through card advantage, resulting in giving your opponent poison counters. Now, the mana base, the first thing you're always going to want to look to upgrade, in my opinion, as far as what to craft, is the lands. And the reason for this is because if you want a double spell, if you want to cast like a one, Whisper of the Dross and Drown in Ichor on turn 3, you need to have 18 sources of untapped black mana, right? And so even with like bringing in these tap lands, it lets me get to 18 sources of black, but they're going to be tapped, right? So the chances of actually having untapped black mana on turn 3 becomes less, right? So if you can run the lands that are dual lands but not tap lands, then that can really help your mana base, which we'll talk about here shortly. And I'll try to go through a little bit faster through these because honestly, if I spend that much time on each single one, we're going to be here for like an hour and a half. So the rares to upgrade this build is to bring in the non-tapped lands, right? So Darkslick Shores, Gloomlake Verge, the Underground River, and then Mirix is a nice utility land that sees a lot of play, so I think it's a relatively safe craft. So these are the sort of things that I would recommend to beginners. If you do like playing Magic the Gathering, investing in lands is a good way to go about it. Do keep in mind too, as far as building your own decks, that your Verge lands make the land count kind of funny. So you'll notice in this build specifically that there's more swamps than islands, and that is to ensure that we have enough swamps on turn 1 to be able to cast the Billis Skull Dweller. But the strategy is largely the same, except for bringing in the Vraska Betrayal's Sting. This one is a little bit of a specific craft because it doesn't see a lot of play outside of the kind of meme build of the one-turn kill. There's a Vraska's talent, one-turn kill with the Innkeeper's talent in Golgari that has fallen out of popularity, but we see it pop in and out. So if you have it, though, I think it fits relatively nicely into the strategy because it gives you a recurring way to proliferate, which can then eventually seal out the game. All right, so here is my second budget list. This is mono blue tempo. Both Dimir tempo and mono blue, I think, make pretty good options. They feel like a pretty good, full, complete strategy with only commons and uncommons. And so for this one, I think that the Brineborn Cutthroat has worked really well. I made a deck that was a mono blue flash deck where the whole point is playing cards only on your opponent's turn. And the Brineborn Cutthroat works really well with this strategy because a lot of the stuff is only being cast on your opponent's turn. The only exception to that rule is the sleight of hand. So if you really want to lean into the Your Go strategy, you can kind of replace this with something else. But then you've got counter spells to disrupt your opponent. And then you've also got Dig to help you go find the Edimurk Crab. It's very similar to Simic Tempo, which we'll also include in this list later. It's much further in, but it is there. But yeah, so as you play your spells, these cards then become cheaper to cast, and you can just seal out the game once you get to them. So just kind of your classic like tempo strategy, get to your big threats, and then disrupt your opponent and seal out the game. And the upgraded list is pretty straightforward because it only has 2 rares, which is Haughty Djinn. Haughty Djinn makes all of those spells that you're casting, like the Moments of Truth and the Negates and the counter spells, all cost 1 less. And then the 3 steps ahead works really well because you can create duplicates of your Edimurk Crab or your Terrors or your Djinns, as well as the cancel itself is cheaper to cast with the Haughty Djinn in play. Otherwise, though, still the same strategy: play spells, disrupt your opponent, win the game. Tempo strategy. Okay, so now that we've covered the better budget decks, Simic Tempo is also really good. Rakdos Sacrifice as well, as far as like the ones that have been performing better, right? So this one is a little bit more of an exploration. I think it works relatively well as a budget deck. You're trying to take advantage of cheap artifacts so that you can play a Memory Guardian and then run away with the Memory Guardian with like a Sheltered by Ghosts. It's a pretty straightforward strategy. And then you also have the ability of creating a 5/4 Vigilance Flyer, right? So the budget deck is definitely going to be toned down in power. But you have a lot of cards that there is a more competitive version that we'll talk about in the upgraded version that is exploring this space, that's leaning off of like the Novice Inspector and the Spyglass Siren, as usually called the Azorius Convoke deck. It used to run the Knight Errant of Eos. So we're seeing it take a little bit more of an artifact-specific direction these days. And so I think the real big payoff here is that you have some decent removal in the Sheltered by Ghosts and the Duskrose Reliquary. And then you can also outvalue your opponent with the Voyage Home, which becomes incredibly cheap to cast with all of the artifacts available to you in this archetype. Now, again, you'll notice the multicolored lands that I just chose the generic tap lands. You're definitely going to want to upgrade the lands to make this deck run better, because you want a turn 1 blue source and a turn 1 white source, which is kind of a difficult task to do in the budget space. And so here's the upgraded version of it, if you will. And this one, we've got all of the non-tap lands, right? So the Seachrome Coast, the Flood Farm Verge, and the Adarkar Wastes. Again, I think I would recommend crafting these. I think they're very important to improve your mana base. I don't know how many times I can stress that. And then the Restless Anchorage is a nice man land to help out against the control matchups and kind of extend if they're able to answer the board. As far as what rares to bring in, I think that the Leyline Axe works really nicely to be able to be a free artifact to play that then makes Memory Guardian into a more viable threat, being able to hit in for 8 damage. And then you have the Regal Bunnycorn, which is a really great target for putting the Sheltered by Ghosts on, because it grows continuously, which then gets out of the damage-based removal of mono red. So if you're up against black, it doesn't matter as much, but against mono red, being able to put something above 5 toughness especially really helps get around the Witchtalker Frenzy, for example. So this one, though, does also have a more specific rare that I think is being explored, finding its way into some niche builds, and that one's Dollmaker's Shop. So I wouldn't craft this one unless you're really in love with the deck, but I do think that there are some decks that are going to take advantage of the token creation. Notice that it does create artifact creatures, so specifically it fits well into this archetype, in my opinion. And then it also gives you an alternative win condition on top of the instead of the Zoetic Glyph, which is more easily disruptible, then you can use this to make your go wide board into very large creatures. All right, so then there's another version that's leaning a little bit more towards the artifact build specifically. So I know they're both artifacts, but one's called Affinity, one's called Artifacts. You'll see the slight variations in them, hopefully. So this one is running things like the Market Gnome, which has a little bit more of the craft, like with the clay-fired bricks, but still kind of a go-wide strategy where you've got the Memory Guardian with the Sheltered by Ghosts. This one is not leaning into the Zoetic Glyph, although you could bring it in. You just have less things that you could animate. Well, I guess it's less of a... The curve out is different, right? So this one is a little bit more of a attempt on being a little bit more controlling because you have the saw blades, the counterspell No More Lies. You also have the glass casket and the Dusk Rose. So you're leaning more towards answering your opponent's threats in this build, and then eventually winning the game through outvaluing your opponent. And this is where I landed on my upgraded version of the Azorius Artifacts build. I've tried a couple of different builds where I really like this one because you have more 2-drops. Originally, like the video that I ran for the gameplay video, I was just running like the collector's vaults and using the collector's vaults to repurpose them into the simulacrum synthesizer, and I feel like that has worked out less well than having more, especially the spring-loaded saw blades, because this is left over after you kill something of your opponent's, is a really nice target for the repurposing bay. And the reason why I like the repurposing bay in this build specifically is because the whole point of the top performing card is the Simulacrum Synthesizer. And so this is like a way of running 8 of the Simulacrum Synthesizers, sort of, right? As long as you build the deck in that direction. And so notably in this build, I stepped away from the Wraths. I wasn't really finding the Wraths to work very well. I mean, there's a lot of Azorius, like, you know, like you're losing to the Azorius Omniscience deck because there's like no Graveyard Hate. You could bring in Graveyard Hate to make this more relevant to the meta, but I wanted to just kind of stay true to the build, if you will. But anyway, yeah, the whole point is to try to repurpose your artifacts into the Simulacrum Synthesizer, and then you have a big spike on 3 because that's what triggers the Simulacrum Synthesizers, and then the Memory Guardian also triggers the synthesizer. And you could bring in Wraths if you want to, because this rebuilds relatively well from Wraths. But I've found that most people that, like, a fair chunk of the meta is already running Wraths. So anyway, you can see that this is not a light investment. It is a very heavy-handed build. Lots of rare lands. Again, we have the classic ones that I do recommend crafting, the Seachrome Coast, A Darker Waste, and Flood Farm Verge. But we've got the Temple of Enlightenment, Fable Passage, and Fountain Port as well. And then Perilous Snare, I explored this with trying to do a little bit more of a start your engines build. I don't think you need to lean so heavily into the start your engines, but still an O-ring that triggers the Simulacrum Synthesizer has been good. Braided Net has been a classic in this archetype since Lost Caverns of Ixalan, being able to tap your opponent's stuff and then give you an incredible amount of card draw in this strategy. Repurposing Bay to take advantage of the lower curve to get it up into the higher curve. Fabrication Foundry helps ramp, and then is another one that can bring back stuff from your graveyard if they've destroyed it. Excuse me. And then we have a Thran Spider that also helps you ramp into double spelling, because you know, once you got your synthesizer down, you would like to cast 2 3-cost spells. So this just kind of a different way to go about it. And there's lots of different Azorius artifact builds out there. There's like the Enigma Jewel builds and such. So the card that is the most important card to craft to get this strategy to work, though, is the Simulacrum Synthesizer, or Simulacrum Synthesizer, and it's a mythic. So if you know, it's an expensive one. It's also not a top tier deck, although it is a rather popular deck, I think, in the casual setting. because it's fun. It's a really fun deck to play, and but it is a costly build. All right, thanks for humoring me and listening to my my walk through the builds of each one, because these do take a fair amount of time to put together. So on that note, if you want to help me out, feel free to join as a YouTube member. I really appreciate those who have joined as YouTube members to kind of help me out monetarily, because this, like I've mentioned before, is very much a passion project. So let the passion continue. Okay, so Azorius Enchantments is another one that's been around. I think it's a pretty popular budget deck because you can get a pretty functional deck out of it with just commons and uncommons. So you've got the Gremlin Tamer and the Inquisitive Glimmer that we got in Duskmourn, and these work really well in the enchantment synergies, right? So Boros Auras, I think, is the more meta build of this, because you've got the Heartfire Hero, which pairs really nicely with the Sheltered by Ghosts, but is less budget friendly, because to get that to really shine, you need the Emberheart Challenger and the Manifold Mouse in red, which, if you've been a part of the channel, you should be very familiar with, because we talk about it every week in my Best of 1, Best of 3 meta review. But anyway, so this one is a little bit different. It's a little bit more budget friendly because of the synergies here. Enchantment spells cost less, and then you've got some rooms that are also enchantments that cost less to unlock with the Inquisitive Glimmer. Whenever you play an enchantment or unlock a room, you create a 1/1, so you've got a little bit of a go wide strategy. And then with the Grand Entryway, helps you create more 1/1s for going wide, and then also pumping those. And then you've got the Bottomless Pool for bouncing and refilling your hand through card draw. Now, the reason why this is a little bit worse than the Voltron build of the Boros Auras is because it doesn't go as big. You're not going to get something to be like an 8/8 double striking mouse with lifelink, right? So it's going to pan out. It's not going to peak as high, right? But it's still, like I mentioned, it's pretty good for the budget space. You've got decent removal with the Trapped in the Screen, Sheltered by Ghosts, and Ossification. And then you just try to answer one for one while your board gets bigger than your opponent's. Okay, and now for the upgraded version, and this one I went towards the Enduring Curiosity with the Silent Hall Creeper. Not all Azorius Enchantments builds go this direction, but having the unblockable creature that then, whenever you damage your opponent, draws a card is a pretty nice synergy. Entity Tracker also helps us draw a bunch of cards, and I leaned fully into the card draw by keeping the Bottomless Pool as well. And whenever you play an enchantment, you or unlock a room, then you're drawing a card. And you also have the Enduring Innocence. So all of the 1/1s that are being spawned off of the Gremlin Tamer are then also drawing us cards with the Enduring Innocence. So it just helps us overwhelm our opponent. And then we've got the classic Azorius lands that I recommend crafting, and then the Temple of Enlightenment. I think most of us got one free copy of this in Foundations, so this one should be you wouldn't need to craft this one, I don't think. Yeah, no mythics. Okay, now enough of Azorius. Let's talk about Mono Black. So the more competitive version of Mono Black is Mono Black Midrange, and it is commonly not in the top 8 in the Best of 1, Best of 3 meta review, because it has some bad matchups. Now, it's a very popular deck. You will bump into it on the ladder. So if I did the top 8 by popularity, it would be like number 2. So that's Mono Black Midrange, which has a slightly different strategy than Mono Black Discard. Now, Mono Black Discard is any version of Mono Black Midrange that's running the Bandit's Talent. And the point of this is to kind of go back to the old school, the rack. If you played Magic back in the day, there was a strategy where you tried to get your opponent hellbent by making them discard all of their cards, so that you can then use the rack to win the game. And Bandit's Talent is basically the version of that, right? That instead of it being colorless is black. But we're attacking our opponent's resources with this strategy, and then ultimately this is our win condition. We're winning through the Bandit's Talent. And it actually works surprisingly well as long as you are up against a strategy that is weak to discard. So if they have any form of card draw like the deck we just covered, you're going to get smoked, right? A go wide strategy that draws cards is going to be terrible against Mono Black Discard. But this deck is going to do relatively well against something like Mono Red, because you're going to eliminate all of those really early creature-based threats, right? And you have plenty of options to do that. So you've got cut down, you've got the let go for the throat, you've got nowhere to run, Shieldred's Edict, Momentum Breaker can do either the hand or creatures. Lots of different ways to attack that. And then we've got the intimidation tactics that I think is seeing more play here and there, being able to remove problematic creatures from your opponent's hand. We've got the duress, so I did a 2-2 split. We've also got the ruthless negotiation, which you can flash back for 2 cards from your opponent's hand. And then we've got the Deep Cavern Bat to disrupt things as well. You could do something like the Cruel Claws Heist, but the lifelink and being able to block with the Deep Cavern Bat, don't underestimate that, right? And then we've got the Demolition Field because man lands can be a little bit of a problem for this deck. All right, and the upgraded version of this one does have a fair amount of mythics. So this one is another one that's also kind of expensive. Soulstone Sanctuary sees a lot of play as a relatively safe craft, at least for the time being, because of the Shapeshifter. So it has Mice synergies, it has Demon synergies for mono black midrange. And then Fountain Port is another one that's a utility land that you see more often in Control. Both relatively safe crafts. Unstoppable Slasher, a full playset of Unstoppable Slasher is played in mono black midrange because of playing the Aclazot's Bloodletter of Aclazot's, which creates the 1-turn kill. This one, I just threw this one in there because like the Slasher is a pretty good sticky threat, and just defensively it answers your opponent's stuff, especially 1-for-1, very well. So I think crafting one of is especially safe, right? The rest of it, though, these are all mythics, which I don't recommend to beginners to craft mythics unless you're absolutely in love with the deck. You know, at some point of playing Magic, you either pay with time or you pay with money, right? And I've paid with time, so I can craft a fair amount of stuff, but that's also because I draft. But I digress. So we've got the Tiny Bones, which allows us to play the things that our opponent has discarded. We've got Liliana the Veil, which can repeatedly make our opponent discard. Also is a win condition in and of itself if we can ultimate. We've got the Hostile Investigator, which gives us value every time that our opponent is discarding. And then we've got Shieldred the Apocalypse, which is if they're running the counter of card draw, we can punish them for doing so. Virtue of Persistence also lets us replay the cards that we've destroyed, and the -3/-3 and gaining 2 life is nice for stabilizing against early aggression. All right, next up is Orzhov Pixie, and what you'll see here is that the most meta deck is Esper Bounce, but 3-color space is impossible to do without bringing in rare lands. So considering we're stuck with these tap lands, what I've decided to do is split it up into Dimir Bounce and Orzhov Pixie. And Orzhov Pixie is half of a life gain strategy. So you've got like the Hinterland Sanctifier, the Runelurker Bat to hit your opponent with the Starscape Cleric, and then playing these ETBs like the Hopeless Nightmare and the Momentum Breaker and the Sheltered by Ghosts. And then I thought Scroll Shift worked relatively well in this strategy, just as being card neutral and being able to get like a repeatable trigger off of the Hopeless Nightmare or the Momentum Breaker works relatively well. And what you'll see is in the upgraded version, Temporary Lockdown is a pretty sweet little combo to be able to throw into this deck, and Scroll Shift works in that strategy as well. So let's talk about that one. All right, so this one is the upgraded Orzhov Pixie list, and I will admit, I 100% stole this one from Sonio. So if you don't already follow Sonio, I highly recommend it. They're always creating really cool decks. I saw Azorius Omniscience, I saw on their channel first before anybody else, and the various stages that it went through. So highly recommend Sonio if you are unaware of them. But anyway, so this deck was built by them and is kind of the deck that I was talking about. The whole point of the deck is to utilize Temporary Lockdown to get the value of replaying the Hopeless Nightmare, the Grim Bauble, the Momentum Breaker in loops. And the Unholy Annex works for the card draw to kind of keep the fuel going in this. Kusel's Flanker is in here to make it more of a meta option against the Azorius Omniscience deck. Lorn of the Third Path allows us to also destroy our own temporary lockdowns or problematic things on our opponent's side. Same with the Get Lost, can pop our own temporary lockdown or one of their threats. And then we have the Tiny Bones Joins Up. And this one is just, I think, another way of making your opponent discard with the Hopeless Nightmare. Maybe I'm missing some form of synergy, but I feel like it's just a fifth copy of a way to attack the opponent's hand. And we do have the classic kind of Orzhov space. So we have the Bleachbone Verge, the Caves of Kolios, and the Concealed Courtyard, which is the black-white version of what I talked about in Azorius. Also recommend crafting this if you like the black-white space. Restless Fortress is the Manland, and then the Soulstone Sanctuary is also the synergizes with the Unholy Annex for demon synergies. And we do have Liliana of the Veil, and this one, if you care more about attacking your opponent's hand, you're going to run Lily. Lily's better against like control matchups. There are some times where the Liliana of the Veil is not a really great craft, so we see her in some decks and not in others. But works well in this build. All right, now, so this is Dimir discard. This one is a little bit different than Dimir bounce. This one is the blue-black version of leaning on to Bandit's talent. So you're bringing in Fear of Isolation and this town ain't big enough, the ability to replay some of your hand hate like the Hopeless Nightmare and the Momentum Breaker. You've also got the Get Out, which allows you to do the same thing as this town bounce or as a counterspell. And then you've got some Spyglass Sirens in here, and really, that one I feel like is kind of the weaker inclusion. You could bring in just an additional 2 more Go for the Throats, but sometimes it's nice to just have a way to close out the game. Like, if Bandit's Talents doesn't hack it for you, being able to attack him with the Flyers can win. All right, and then this is the more upgraded version, and the reason, this town ain't big enough, it really starts to shine when you include it with the Storm Chaser's talent, which allows you to loop the This Town Ain't Big Enough, because you can play This Town Ain't Big Enough to bounce the Storm Chaser's talent after getting it back from the graveyard, right? So you can just keep playing these back and forth, and that can win you games just in and of itself, because each time you're playing the Storm Chaser's talent, you're getting something that gets bigger, and then when you're bouncing it, you're making those 1/1s grow because they're prowess 1/1 otters. And I thought the Thundertrap Trainer was a fun one to explore. I definitely think that, craft with care on this one. It does see some play in Teamer Otters, which is more common in best of 3. There's a couple of combos that are built around the Thundertrap Trainer, but, not a hugely important rare compared to the Storm Chaser's talent, which sees a lot of play in Simic Tempo, Esper Bounce, Dimir Bounce, fill in the blank deck. You'll see this one a lot. And then the Entity Tracker, I think, works relatively well for the space too, because you are playing a lot of enchantments that can give you the card draw to then answer your opponent's stuff. And then we've got the Darkslick Shores, the Gloom Lake Verge, and the Underground River as the top crafts, in my opinion, for the archetype. And then Kaido. Kaido is a pain in the butt. So Kaido works really well so Kaido struggles a little bit against early aggression, because then they can just overwhelm them. But Kaido can do really well in a mid-range to control matchup and just run away with the game. So Kaido definitely sees play in other decks. Relatively safe craft. Okay, we're going to talk about Dimir for a little bit here, because there's a couple of different versions of Dimir. So this one is my attempt to try to get a Dimir midrange to work in the budget space. Now, the Dimir midrange is more of a tempo strategy, and then it's a little nitpicky, but I think it's more tempo than it is actually midrange. We've got a plethora of disruption. The problem with this strategy in the uncommon space is that it doesn't have a really great way to end the game, right? So we can answer our opponent's stuff, but we've got like Spyglass Siren, Diversion Unit, the 1/1s off of the Feybloom, and like Deep Cavern Bats. So you kind of win through like poke damage in the air. And then the rest of it is just trying to answer your opponent's stuff 1 for 1. And this is my take on the upgraded Dimir midrange build. So you've got the Enduring Curiosities. Some midrange builds include Curiosities, some don't. Tishana's Tidebinder, I really like this one right now. It's worse off against aggro, so you kind of have to play whether or not you want this over like Preacher of the Schism based off of how much mono red you're seeing. And then the Fairy Mastermind works really well with it gives you the flyer for the Kaido, but it also gives you just kind of an ability to continue drawing so that you can continue to answer your opponent one for one, which is really missing in the budget deck. And but it also punishes your opponent if they're doing the same. And the the one mythic is or there's two mythics, sorry. Kaido is another really great option, and the Shieldred the Apocalypse. We Shieldred at one point in time. Shieldred was a 4 of. Basically, if you were in black, it was mandatory. I feel like there's a lot of really good threats for Shieldred, where we've seen a little bit of a decrease in Shieldred in popularity, but still a really great mid-range threat, right? And so this one right now is a very viable strategy in best of one. It's in best of three. It's a little bit worse in best of one, but still doable. And so you've got your 3 must-craft lands for Dimir. You've got the Manland with the Restless, and then you've got the Soulstone Sanctuary and the Fountain Port. So you can kind of see the most important lands kind of follow a similar pattern. All right, and then this is my budget build of Dimir Bounce. And so you've got Dimir Discard, you've got Dimir Midrange, you've got Dimir Bounce, and they're all different strategies, right? So this one is leaning more heavily into the get out, fear of isolation, this town ain't big enough, leaning further away from the win condition of winning through Bandit's talent, and instead is relying on sealing out the game with your Spyglass Siren, fear of isolation, and Flood Pit's Drowner. And the upgraded version for Dimir Bounce is fallen out of popularity just because the Esper Bounce has been, I think, proved to be a little bit better of a strategy. But you definitely want to craft the Storm Chaser's talent to loop with This Town Ain't Big Enough, and then you can definitely smooth out the lands. But you can see that the majority of the Dimir Bounce strategy is relatively well represented in uncommons and commons outside of Kaido and the Storm Chaser's talent. All right, now this one is a really fun one. This one I've enjoyed a lot. So this one is Orzhov Aristocrats. It's different than the Raise the Past deck. So the Raise the Past combo deck is trying to use Dewdrop Cure and Raise the Past, which is a rare, to bring everything back from your graveyard, right? This one is trying to use Vengeful Blood Witch to win the game. And so you're trying to sacrifice a bunch of things that are really good to sacrifice, like the Infestation Sage, the Gnawing Vermin, and the Nesting Bot, to grow your Bartolome, and then to ping your opponent for every time that a creature dies. So you can get multiple pings going. There is a little bit of the graveyard synergy because the Snarling Gorehound with all of these little 1-drops works really well to dig through your graveyard. Dewdrop Cure can then bring back the combo of the Bartolome and the Ellis Ilkor, Sadistic Pilgrim. And then you've got some removal options, some just things that also sacrifice well. So because you can sacrifice an artifact or a creature. So Dusk Rose Reliquary, the Grim Bauble, the Hopeless Nightmare, all decent options for attacking your opponent's resources. And the upgraded version is... So again, this is different than the Raise the Past combo deck, where you're trying to win the game off of like the Star Escape Cleric. Sometimes it's also called the Orzhov Life Gain deck. So this is a different approach. But Raise the Past still works really well in the strategy. Enduring Innocence allows us to get some card draw off of all of the little 1/1s entering the battlefield. Zahur then makes everything that we sacrifice create a 2/2 zombie creature token that we can then sacrifice that token. So it gives us a lot more fodder in a single card. And then the Gas Guzzler allows us to have an additional sack outlet. So you'll notice I cut some of the Bartolome's out because you can get the... I didn't find that it was necessary to have as many. Especially with the Raise the Past being able to... You just need one of these to be able to start sacrificing everything. But similar strategy, you're still just trying to whittle at your opponent's life total through little pings through the Vengeful Blood Witch. And then we've got the classic 3 of the the three most common black-white lands, and then we've got the Shadowy Backstreet, which is the Surveil land. And the Surveil land sees less play. This one's more commonly included in Graveyard Matters decks, right? So since we're trying to get a Bartolome into the graveyard, the Surveil is helpful. All right, and I want to stress this one, especially on this one, right? I want to stress that this was a brew, that this was something that I was trying to have fun with, right? Which is part of Magic the Gathering, right? For all you spikes out there, part of it is having fun. So this one is it discard, and this one I have to say, craft with care. This one is an exploration. It's a difficult strategy to get to work. You can get it to work though. So your only way of actually winning the game though is through the Scrounging Skyray and the Marauding Mako. So treat this as a control deck where these are your win conditions, not as a tempo deck, because if they nuke these and they go to the graveyard, you're gonna have a hard time winning, right? But if you are able to protect them and keep them alive, it can do the trick, right? And then you've got a lot of like, you know, just draw, discard things that then fuel your Sky Rays, and this town ain't big enough is a little bit awkward, but I've found it useful to be able to bounce something of your opponents and then replay one of your things that haven't grown into a giant threat yet. Spell Pierce is a way of protecting. You've got Torch the Tower and Burst Lightning to slow down aggro, and then you've got the Opt and I guess into the Flood mod to disrupt as well. But Opt and Sleight of the Hand both help you dig into your combo pieces, if you will. So it's a little bit of a sketchy build, but I think it's close to something, and look forward to hearing your comments on it. I think this is the one that's going to get the most like, this was a failure, but it's close. It's close. All right, and then this one's also really fun. So this one, it's a little bit for those who have a larger collection, right? It has a fair amount of rares. It has the River Pyre Verge, the Shivan Reef, and the Spireglough Canal, which is the Izzet kind of must-craft lands, if you will. It has the Temple of Epiphany, which I think, again, is a freebie. And then it has the Thundering Falls, which is the Surveil, which helps us kind of like hit into our combo. So this one is, the point of this archetype, right, is built around the momentum, or monument, I always call it momentum, monument to endurance. And the value that the Monument to Endurance creates is insane. And there's a lot of people who are trying to get it to work, right? And so this is where I landed. I think that it's not quite there yet. It's definitely not tier 1, but it's on its path. It's on its journey, right? So you've got like the Sweeper, Brotherhood's End. Artist Talent works incredibly well with it because all of your non-creature spells cost 1 less to cast, and then whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it triggers a Rummage, where you discard and then draw a card, which works with the momentum or Monument to Endurance, which, you know, will turn your Opt into something that actually triggers the discard, which I think is really cool. And then you've got the, well, let's not hop ahead yet. Ill-Timed Explosion also helps level the playing field, so that you can then outvalue your opponent with the Monument to Endurance and just burn them out. 3 Steps Ahead, also for creating copies of the Monument to Endurance, as well as disrupting our opponent's plays. Roaring Furnace works really well with the Ill-Timed Explosion, because then we can do this to hit everything for 7. And you can also play it out to deal damage early on into the game, and then later on in the game gives you card draw to then, you know, hopefully outvalue your opponent. As far, there is a mythic that I threw in there as well, which I want to get a home for Ral, Crackling Wit, because it's a cool card, right? So whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put a loyalty counter on Ral, and with the discounted like Artist's Talent and drawing all of the cards, all of the rummaging, I feel like we can cast a fair amount of cards, which means we can ramp the Ral pretty well. And then also it can downtick for -3 to draw 3 cards and discard 2, which is a double trigger on the Monument to Endurance. So I feel like they had an intent of binding Ral into some form of Izzet discard strategy. It might be missing a little bit of tools to really shine, but it's close. You know, I'd love to hear your guys' feedback on it as well. And yeah, maybe it needs some direct damage, where if they've like if they get rid of the monument to endurance, it's a little bit hard to actually like win the game. So maybe it needs to be a little bit less of a glass cannon. But you can also just win through the prowess creatures off of Ral too. So just options. All right, and now back to some more serious decks. Okay, so a lot of the decks that I just talked about are brews and explorations to try to get the archetype to work in a budget build. This one feels better. This one feels more viable, and I've had a fair amount of success with it in the budget space. So Rakdos Sacrifice is all about leveraging the value off of Disturbing Mirth and being able to draw 2 cards, and then whenever you sacrifice this enchantment later, being able to create a 2/2 is a lot of value for a single card to have, right? And then you just fill the deck with a whole bunch of things that are really good fodder to blow up. So you've got the Greedy Freebooter, the Grim Bauble, the Hopeless Nightmare, Momentum Breaker, Nowhere to Run, Bitter Reunion, all already have created their value and then can be sacrificed as good targets to the Disturbing Mirth. Torch the Tower, you can bargain to sacrifice something. Same with the Final Vengeance, you can sacrifice to get you have to sacrifice something to be able to exile for 1 black, but that's a pretty good payoff. And then Clockwork Percussionist is a decent one to sacrifice too because it allows us to give us additional dig. You're going to want to sacrifice this one a little bit later in the game when you've got more mana to use the card that you hit. But do keep in mind you can play it until the end of your next turn, so you don't have to play it this very turn. So that's nice. And then we've got the Sawblade Skin Ripper, which at the beginning of your end step, if you sacrifice 1 or more permanents, this creature deals that much damage to any target. And sometimes you're sacrificing a lot of cards in 1 turn, and so this is able to answer something on the board. And then a 3/2 menace, as long as you've kept the game small by attacking their resources, blowing things up, this actually attacks in relatively well in a small board situation. Okay, and the upgraded version, and this is one I've seen people take this list to Mythic. This is a very viable strategy. So Spiteful Hexmage works really nice because you can sacrifice the Cursed Roll itself, and then you have a 3/2 for 1 to really either apply a lot of pressure or to prevent a lot of pressure being pushed against you, against like mono red. Fear of Missing Out allows us to discard, gives us a little bit of filtering that this deck is missing a little bit, but Delirium is really easy to turn on with all the sacrifice as well, and Fear of Missing Out combos really nicely with Urbrask's Forge, because Urbrask creates a token at the beginning of each combat step. So when you have an additional combat step of Fear of Missing Out, you create another token on Urbrask's Forge and increase the ramp of how quickly this card closes out the game. I've liked the Seer Slicer Goblin in this build. I think that you have a relatively enough early 1-drops to be able to trigger the raid relatively easily. Same with the Urbrask Forge tokens that you don't care if they die, which then allows you to have 1/1 red goblin tokens that are perfect sack fodder. So I think it works relatively well in this archetype. And then we have Braids. And Braids is how we win the value game if the Disturbing Mirth is not enough, because we often have more resources than our opponent by design, and so being able to sacrifice things that our opponent can't allows us to then hit them for 2 damage and draw a card. So Braids is an alternative win condition. We have the Rakdos kind of trifecta, so the Black Cleave Cliffs, the Verge, the Blazemire Verge, and the Sulphurous Springs are the Rakdos must-crafts. This one's also running 2 Restless Vents, just to have, if they do have a lot of sweepers and a lot of answers, it's nice to have a little bit of control. And then also the Menace works well, like how the Menace creature in the budget build did well. The Restless Vents works relatively well as long as you keep the board small. And then we've got 1 Mirix, which is also here to just give us sack fodder and to help out against really controlling decks. All right, so now I just did this kind of randomly too. It just turns out that the beginning I feel stronger about, and the ending I feel stronger about. There's some brew in the middle. So Simic Tempo is a classic budget build. Lots of people will be familiar with this one. You're trying to, similar to mono to mono blue, you're leaning off of the Edimurk Crab and the Tolarian Terror as your win conditions. You're playing a little bit less disruption, less counterspells, but you're filling the graveyard for the Edimurk Crab and the Tolarian Terror a lot faster than playing all of those blue spells. And you do that through Seed of Hope and Cash Grab. Now, the other synergy that's really nice and at the uncommon level is the Up the Beanstalk, which allows you to card draw off of the Tolarian Terror and the Crab. I've found this town ain't big enough to work relatively well in this archetype as well, just because you can bounce one of your cheap crabs to tap something else again, and it does trigger a card draw if you do have the Up the Beanstalk. And as we've seen before, we've got the Storm Chaser's Talent, which combines really nicely with This Town Ain't Big Enough. We've got the Yavimaya Coast and the Botanical Sanctum. This one is not running the Verge lands, and that's partially just because of what mana you need on the turn one. You could bring in the Verge lands if you would like to. I just haven't found them to be necessary because you'll notice that this is an ultra low land count. Ultra low, right? We're running 16. It's a little bit thin. Some decks run 17, but with all of the fixing in this deck, it actually functions relatively well as long as you have the 14 sources of green. You just have to be good about picking up the lands when you're using your cash grabs and your Seed of Hopes instead of other things, right? But 16 lands is about as low as I would go. I wouldn't go any further, right? And as you can see, it's another one like Mono Blue, very few cards to actually craft to get this strategy to work. And it works well in the budget build. All right, and we've got Golgari Selfmill. And so this was a strategy that was brought to the Pro Tour in the second week of Aether Drift. And it's been tweaked a little bit. I did put my little stank on it, right? But it's primary, for the Pro Tour, it's a very budget build. And they did bring in the actual lands to play in Golgari. But the general strategy is leaning fully off of Up the Beanstalk, being able to get value off of the Gravestalker and the Swarm and the Marauder, which all get cheaper off of the mill that you're using, like Rubber Belt Maverick, Molt Tender, Cenote Scout, Vermin. All of these are just to fill the graveyard, right? Say Its Name. I've seen some lists run Altenac and 4 copies of Say Its Name. It's just personally not my favorite, but I do think that it works relatively well for pumping everything into the graveyard and then winning through Up the Beanstalk. And that's basically the strategy of this one. So this is my version of the Golgari Selfmill from the Pro Tour. So we have the Verge land, we have the Land of War Wastes, and we have the Blooming Marsh. And so these are the Golgari versions of the Must-Crafts, if you will. Souls of the Lost is a way to take advantage of all of the permanents in the graveyard, since this is a very high creature build, 36 creatures. You have a lot of stuff that fills your graveyard that is a creature, which works nicely for Souls of the Lost. More spells, Souls of the Lost works a little bit worse. Urborg, I think, is a great fit for this deck. It wasn't included in the version that I saw in the Pro Tour, but I think that a creature that mills and then gets really big for all of the creatures fits wonderfully into the strategy, and I think if you haven't tried it, definitely check it out. And then Overlord of the Baelmerk, I also can't remember off the top of my head. I don't think it was included because, again, I think the Pro Tour version was a budget build. Overlord of the Baelmerk works really well in the strategy too, though, because being able to mill into your payoffs. And we've also got the Harvester of Misery, which is a nice way to kind of slow down if you're not able to just answer the board with your Overwhelming Remorse and creature threats. I found go wide strategies can get a little bit over the top. You can also discard it, which then fuels creatures into your graveyard. So there's some flexibility there that's really nice. And as far as cards, I did fail to mention set specific. So Harvester of Misery we see as a sideboard option in black, often to punish go wide strategies. And then Overlord of the Baelmerk we see more of a niche build or a niche inclusion in like Esper Self Bounce will sometimes run a copy or two. So relatively safe crafts. However, the Urborg and the Souls of the Lost are very specific to this deck. They do not see a lot of play outside of this deck. All right, and last but not least, and I'm going to apologize, I think I said there were 17, and the reason why is I miscounted. If you'll notice, I did a budget for Golgari was 15, and the upgraded was 16, so I actually have 16 budget decks. My apologies. Still a ton of work went into these. Okay, lots of love, lots of love. So this one is my budget build on Gruul Delirium. A lot of the Gruul Delirium cards are uncommon and uncommon. You can get the strategy to work. You're going to fill your graveyard with the Cenote Scout, the Patchwork Beastie, the Maverick, the Seed of Hope, to enable Delirium, to get a Wicker Folk, to be a 4/3, hit it with the Violent Urge to make it into a 5/4 with Double Strike, hit them for 10 damage. It's kind of the point of this deck. And then you've just got, instances and sorceries to disrupt your opponent's plays, and it works relatively well for the common and uncommon space. The thing that's really hurting this is to play in the 2-color, you need to bring in a fair amount of tap lands, and then this deck does not want to be taken down a turn by having the tap lands. So aggro is kind of difficult to build in the budget space because of that, but it still works relatively well. And last but not least is my version of the upgraded Gruul Delirium build. So we've got the 4 copies of the Fear of Missing Out. This is the reason why you're playing this archetype. It really is difficult to say that it functions. It functions so much better once you include this card because of being able to attack twice with the Wildfire Wicker Folk. You can hit them for 20 because you get the double strike. You can attack twice. There you go. Inti, Cynical of the Sun, is also another one that I really like. Just being able to discard a card helps get the Delirium, and you like the maneuverability of what you can manipulate with this. I like a lot, and then also giving something trample is nice so that you don't just get chump blocked, right? Because if you give something double strike, you just get a 1/1 blocks it. It doesn't matter that it has double strike, right? So adding a little bit of trample into the deck I've really liked, and along those lines, I've been really impressed with the Balustrade Worm. It's one of those that's like, it's a payoff for it being put into your graveyard, and then the fact that it has 5 power works nicely with the double strike win in 1 turn. So I think I've seen some decks exploring this all the way up to 4 copies, and I settled on 2 because sometimes it's awkward when you have it in your hand, considering that we are kind of on a low land count. And then we've got, the classic 3 for the Gruul space: Copperline Gorge, Carplusian Forest, and the Thorinspire Verge, which I think are all pretty safe crafts. I guess these are all pretty specific to the archetype in general. Inti sees some in mono red aggro as well. So we made it in under an hour. Thank you once again for listening to my ramblings about Magic the Gathering. I've been playing Magic the Gathering for, almost 30 years, and it's really fun to be able to share all of this with you, right? I mean, I can brew all of this by myself. It's very enjoyable, but also sharing it with you guys brings me joy. So I hope they find you well. I hope you enjoy my takes on them. Feel free to leave comments below about, I tried this deck out, it's complete ass. That's okay. Always looking for feedback, always looking to improve things. If you see something that's like, why didn't you include this? Feel free to leave a comment. And again, anybody who, if you can help support me monetarily, I greatly appreciate it. But again, if not, it's not necessary. It's just, it's a nice perk. It's a nice icing on top, right? So thank you to my YouTube members again. Really appreciate you. And So Monday, tomorrow, I'll be doing my last Best of 1, Best of 3 meta review for Aether Drift. And then on Friday, I will be doing my pre-release guide for Tarkir. And then I will be taking a break. And then you will not see me until the Tarkir brews on the 2nd week of April. I will be back on, the April 8th is the release date. So I'll show you guys some of my early brews for the Tarkir set, and we'll be back to kind of the week 1. We'll be back to the week 1 Best of 1, Best of 3 meta review on April 14th. So hope that gives you an idea of why you are not seeing me come this Friday. And take care, everybody. Good luck crushing it on the ladder, as always. Good luck in your RCQs. And if you, ever want to reach out to me about anything, I hope those who have found me to be very open to helping you out with sideboards, whatever, right? I'm here to try to help you have a more enjoyable Magic the Gathering experience. And speaking of which, if you have crafted some of these and you're like, hey, these cards are banned, you're on alchemy. I made a video about it. Switch over to standard, then you'll be fine. Take care, everybody.